Today, on a special college football playoff edition of the Sports Reporters. Finally, after a century of grumbling, it's here. A 4-round playoff to crown a national champion. Can the Bulldogs win it all, even if they're starting their backup quarterback? Did the powers that be create a playoff masterpiece or a monstrosity? And who are the winners and losers in year one of college football's new reality? I'm Jeremy Schaap, and these are today's Sports Reporters.
I'm Nicole Auerbach, a University of Michigan alum whose very first college football game was App State beating Michigan at the Big House.
I'm Paul Finebaum, and as a young sports reporter, my dream was to make it to Dick Schaap's The Sports Reporters. I failed miserably. Now, late in life, I am here.
I'm Ryan McGee. I cover college football for ESPN, but really what I do every Friday and Saturday is I carry Paul Finebaum's bags to and from the airport as we hit the road for the SEC.
I'm Josh Pate. I cover college football for CBS, host Josh Pate's college football show, and believe it or not, I supply my own wardrobe.
So we're finally here, the first expanded college football playoff. The dream has been realized, but there is no shortage of discontentedness out there. So before these games get underway finally, and perhaps make some of these issues moot, is this the way it should be, Nicole?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, part of the reason that we all deal with and put up with everything that happens off the field, and we can certainly complain about seeding and rankings and how this thing is structured, but we put up with all of that to have great games. And the expanded college football playoff is giving us more meaningful games down the stretch in the regular season. And now we have these amazing games that are still to be played, including games on campus, which is where college football belongs. So yes, I think it is already working as intended.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, we can find a million faults with the system. We just don't have the time or the desire. But it is progress, because I've been around long enough to remember when there was a debate between fan bases who number one was, because you had different polls with different meaning. We've come so far from those dark days that I think we ought to celebrate this week. As flawed as it is, we are getting a legitimate playoff, unlike anything we have ever seen before, with road games, with campus games, with cold weather games, and most important, meaningful games.
The regular season this year was the best since 2007. And let's not take for granted the fact that the 4 games we have to start the first 12-team college playoff, South Bend, Indiana, the Horseshoe, Austin, Texas, and Happy Valley. I mean, those 4 are on anyone's lists of must-have to go to college campuses. So that's as good an opening weekend. I realize Alabama fans don't want to hear this, and South Carolina fans don't want to hear this, but starting the playoff in those 4 venues is something that you would have written up in a fantasy scenario.
Josh?
What Ryan said there is the key for me. The regular season was, by many accounts, mine included, the best regular season that we've probably seen since 2007. I thought the 2021 regular season was really good as well. I'm a little bit different than most people. I'm in the minority on this because I'm a regular season guy first and foremost. Like, as long as you give me my fall Saturdays, anything at the end of it, it's a caboose for me. It's icing on the cake. I don't think playoff centric. So I love it. Like, I love that we go home campuses. We finally get to test the cold weather playoff theory in college football. And way too much is going to be made of the first iteration of this as it relates to playing in cold weather. But I love it. Love the home factor especially. You give me my fall Saturdays and everything else is gravy for me.
Yeah, Josh, by the way, I got to go to Columbus. Yeah, I was going to say, Jeremy, I got to go to Columbus. So I appreciate what Josh is saying, but I'm going to test the fall cold weather. And we'll see how that goes.
We've been talking about this for a long, long time. So when we talk about, kinks that have to be worked out, seeding challenges, is it really the best way to go with those conference champions, getting the buys? What would you like to see change, Paul?
Well, certainly the seating has to change, Jeremy. And while Ryan may be going to Columbus, I'm still disappointed. I'm going to Austin, where it's only going to be 66. I was hoping more for 76. Sorry, Ryan. I'll have to carry my own bags. But my point being, Jeremy, Boise State and Arizona State should not have a bye. I don't mean to sound elitist, even though I work in the SEC primarily. We tend to wear that on our sleeves, but they will. After they reboot this thing for 26, it will be a more even-keeled system where a school like Oregon, who's the #1 seed, has a rougher path than perhaps Penn State or someone else. But, I mean, we are quibbling. The fact that we're going to have some amazing matchups, not only in this round, but in the next round. We have the possibility of Georgia and Notre Dame. Those two have played a few times in meaningful games as recently as 1980 for the national championship when Herschel Walker was just a freshman.
I would love to see them fix this in time for next season. When you talk about the seeding issues, there should be no world where the #1 overall seed has a tougher path than somebody else in the bracket. Like, that's how brackets work. And you're supposed to be incentivized to be the #1 overall seed. You shouldn't have an argument that the loser of the Big Ten championship game has a better path than the winner of the Big Ten championship game. I think the rankings being different than the seeding was very confusing to a lot of fans. I think that, you know, it kind of bumped teams down that should have been ranked 3rd and 4th overall. And so it affected the seeding for the teams that drew them in the bracket. And that's just what's not fair. But again, to Paul's point, like, we are quibbling. The fact that the big argument about snubs and inclusion in that final Selection Sunday was about one team means that the size of the bracket probably was right. The rest of the teams, most people agreed on, and it was just a question of seeding. So I think you can fix that and either just go 1 through 12 and include the 5 conference champions in there, or reseed after the first round. But again, that is a small fix. I think it's something that is easy to fix as well.
I'll tell you something else, Nicole. You talked about the fans being a little confused, and I think that was readily apparent to the 4 of us once we got closer to Selection Sunday. Another thing that the messaging was probably a little poor on was why the playoff had to be constructed this way to begin with. It's very easy, you know, for me to sit here and yell in this microphone, I hate that there are first-round buys for conference champs only, which I do. But I also, and anyone else who disagrees with it needs to understand, yeah, we're probably headed towards a more fixed version of this. But number 2, you weren't getting your expanded playoff without the sign-off from all of those powers that be, all of those conference commissioners. And to get the sign-off, you had to have auto-inclusion. It was a non-negotiable, as you well know, as everyone here well knows, for a lot of these folks to sign on the dotted line. I'm sure we'll fix this in a couple of years, but if you're a fan of the expanded playoff, probably just clasp your hands together right now and thank the good Lord above you've got it, and then ... Whatever comes after the ellipsis comes a couple of years from now, but hey, at least we got it.
And I'll say this too, you mentioned first-round buys. I don't like it. You know, that's very NFL to me. And I say it so much that I've been told to quit saying it, but I'll say it anyway, Jeremy. I like my Saturday football to look like Saturday, and I like my Sunday football to look like Sunday. And a first-round bye is just very NFL. You know, I grew up on Division II, what we used to call 1AA, now FCS campuses. And those brackets, for the most part, until recent years, were 16-team brackets. Everyone had to play the same number of games. And, you know, it's enough of a benefit. It's enough of starting on first base, you know, if you are a #1 seed and you're hosting a home game in the first round. I don't like the fact that we have buys. I like it to be evenly divisible. I like 4. I like 8. I like 16. I think more than that's too much because the 17th team, honestly, whatever, dude, you're 17th. You don't really have an argument at this point. But 16, I'm not good at math. Maybe that's what it is, Jeremy. I just like everything to be evenly divisible.
Well, wait, you know, whatever number you get to, there's going to be controversy. There's going to be disagreement. You know, Paul, in certain precincts of the state of Alabama, there is, you know, some dissatisfaction with the system that we saw.
Yeah, Jeremy, I think you're right. And there are a few precincts in Alabama. I'm not even sure they're part of the United States, but they do call in the Finebaum show, so I hear from them. And I mean, their complaints really went on deaf ears. I agreed with them in principle, but it was hard even for somebody who has swam in the waters of Alabama football most of my career to be really outraged. And the calling card was that their program had just lost 24-3 to a really mediocre Oklahoma team. So I think because of that, we didn't get a lot of outrage like Florida State a year ago when the Attorney General was filing lawsuits, or at least threatening lawsuits, and all kinds of bodily harm was being thrown around by a bunch of angry people, and then including seceding, terrible word to use in the South, from the ACC. But ultimately, where we are is a situation that was done fairly hastily, Jeremy. I think that they'll tweak it. Exactly how and when is somewhat under review. But you have one angry commissioner specifically, the man who represents the SEC. So if he wants change, he will likely get change. But it's better than it could have been. Remember, Tony Petitti, the Big Ten commissioner, was at one time in negotiations with Greg Sankey as his drafting partner, wanting an automatic number one seed for either the SEC or the Big Ten in 4 automatic qualifiers. So I think we did better than that.
Yeah, I think that what's important to think about is what Josh said about how the negotiations got us to this point. They also built this model when there were 5 power conferences and everything was a little bit more balanced. I mean, if Oregon comes into this thing from the Pac-12 and Texas is in the Big 12, we don't really have that same seeding issue because everyone's more bunched up and balanced near the top. And I think when you see some of the imbalances or the issues that become problems now, it's in part because you have these mega conferences and a lot of brands. And that's why if you get 3 versus 4 teams in from the SEC, it's disappointing because you have a lot of mouths to feed. You have a lot of programs that expect to be in the college football playoff year in and year out. And Paul, to your point, I think that's why you had that conversation, which could come up again, about multiple auto bids, because you want that access point when your conference is 16, 17, 18 teams wide. And so I think that led to a lot of the issues, and the imbalanced schedules within the same conference led to some of those problems too.
Some of the conversation that started to sneak in towards the end of the year, we had Lane Kiffin be vocal about what the value proposition was of playing in the conference championship game. We had Oregon win their conference title game and seemingly get a tougher draw than the loser. And I don't think that you can talk about that without talking about what we're talking about here. Because while the typical fan, myself included, may look and say, however big the field is, let's just seed it and come what may, 16, 12, whatever. I'm not sure that people who are responsible for running conferences, especially the Big Ten and the SEC, look at it the same way. I think they look at future expansion or maybe realignment of the format and say, how can we crystallize our conference races into this thing? And the way you do it is what we're talking about. I may not like the format personally, but if you guarantee me, the SEC, or guarantee me, the Big Ten, a certain number of chairs at the table, well, then I know I've got the spots. Then I can decide to go about formatting my conference race however I want to, but I've maximized the importance of that conference race, and I've maintained the value of the inventory for my media partner, and I've done away with the foolishness of any of my coaches saying, I'm not sure that I want to race for this conference championship anymore.
It should be difficult to get in. You know, it's interesting with the Alabama fan base because a lot of teams seem to be operating on this idea of, well, it's okay that we have a loss. It's okay that we have 2 losses. And then it became, well, it'll probably be okay that we have 3 losses. It's not okay. And I don't care what your schedule is. I don't care what conference you play in. It has to be difficult to get into the postseason. And that's where I worry about way expanding all this. And when it comes to seeding, I cover college baseball. And every single year we pull out that stat. The number 1 national seed hasn't won the national championship since Miami in the 1990s. It just, having that seed doesn't guarantee anything. You still have to take care of your business. But I think it still needs to be difficult to get in. It's why I came around on a 4-team college football playoff when in the beginning I hated it because it felt too exclusive. But then I kind of dug the fact that it was difficult to get in. So it still needs to, it was really interesting. We talk about people not understanding how the seeding was going to work or how the schedule was going to work or that we're going to play football till January the 20th. But what they really didn't understand was you still need to win all your games. You know, if you win all your games, it'll take care of itself. And if you lose 3, just because you are who you think you are, that doesn't guarantee you a spot in the playoff. This is not the National Hockey League.
Is it really important to get it exactly right, though? Aren't the controversies and what we get to talk about for the last couple of weeks, isn't that part of the fun, Paul?
Well, it's part of my job, so yes, it is part of the fun.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, again, not to give away the secret to the kingdom here, but there's nothing quite like angry Alabama fans. I think books, 30 for 30s, and Dead Trees can attest to that. But the point is, that's really what makes college football different. It is the messiness. You don't have that in the NFL. The NFL has fantastic rivalries. They're legendary, but there's nothing quite like an angry group of college football fans. And I think the angriest I've ever seen was last year. Florida State took it to a different level with all the literally insane complaints and threats that were made. I almost felt like we were watching the political world for a moment. But this year, it was tame. I mean, if you were really a decent Alabama fan that was true to yourself, you knew you didn't belong in the playoff. You just didn't like the fact that schools like SMU got in, and Arizona State and Boise State, and especially Clemson, schools that you really think in your heart of heart you're better than. But Jeremy, controversy is always what sells in college football. Many fiefdoms have been created. Josh can attest to it, and I've already alluded to my career. So, yes, we want more of that.
I don't think anyone's being chased away from the sport because of the playoff format. The playoff format rubs some people the wrong way. I'm with Ryan. I actually didn't mind when it was contracted down to 4. Only because I knew I was in the minority, but I love the maximization of importance on games. Ohio State loses to Michigan in that format, it's the end of the world. Now they go into the playoff, which is okay. But even if I'm turned off by that, I'm not stopping watching college football because of that. There may be other elements in the room, Jeremy. There may be things like the way the portal is structured now, or the way NIL works, and just the overall different feel, the way the adhesive used to connect you to the sport. Maybe part of that adhesive is deteriorating a little bit, but I don't think it's the format of the postseason that would dare chase anyone away. There could be 15 other elephants in the room. I don't think it's the postseason, though.
I would also argue that the sky is still falling in Columbus, by the way. I mean, this is part of what makes college football great, is you could still have a spot in a meaningful postseason game, and still rivalry games are like life and death, right? And it just defines every single waking moment for you for the rest of the year. And I think you have great rivalries in the NFL, but it is not the same as when it's a school that you grew up going to games, or you literally spent 4 years of tuition to attend that school. It just feels a little bit different. And I think because of the messiness, because for a long time a national champion was decided by polls and decided you could claim a national champion, like that's always been part of this sport. And I personally would even argue that the person that gets to toast a Pop-Tart in a football-shaped toaster trophy is part of also what makes this sport what it is. It doesn't take itself too seriously in some areas, and then it takes itself a little bit too seriously in some of these arguments.
All right, well, let's step back a little bit from the process and talk about what's actually going to happen on the field. Of those 8 teams that did not get buys, that are playing in this first round, I'll ask each of you, which of them do you think is most likely to win 4 in a row and win the national championship on January 20th? Let's start with you, Paul.
Yeah, I think Texas is probably best positioned because they got a good draw at number one. They ended up with a very pedestrian Clemson team. They lost their biggest rivalry game of the year on the final Saturday, and because Miami couldn't handle going to Syracuse, they backed into the championship game, and then they win it on a 56-yard field goal. So, but I don't think they're a match. I think the other team that is intriguing is Ohio State. Talk about meaningful games. What we were talking about a minute ago, that rivalry with Michigan was so irrelevant because of the 12-team playoff that we nearly had.
It was still relevant, Paul. Everyone is still.
Let me finish my point. Hold on, Nicole.
Okay.
I was trying to say it was so irrelevant that we nearly had a riot after the game. That was my point. Not that it's irrelevant.
Okay, I agree with you.
It's incredibly relevant.
Is it relevant
we have
in the
never seen
sense-
anything quite like that. That's why it was so important to the people of Ohio State and Michigan. So I'll cede my time to Nicole.
Were they actually better off losing that game in terms of the way things played out?
I don't think so. I don't think so, considering that there's only one more miscue available for Ryan Day. So I would have, in a perfect world, rather have won that game because just to further my point a minute ago, nothing means more than that. I don't live in that area, but I think that game would rival a national championship for Ryan Day.
I think that this is the time for Ohio State to be national championship or bust, right? We talked about that all season long, and here it is. But they're also going to do this in a stadium where it might be filled with Vols fans, right? Because people are so down after the loss to Michigan. It's going to be really interesting, I think, for that first round game.
I think Ohio State's the answer here. Ohio State has the talent roster to make the run. Let's also understand there is a possibility that if they're going to rattle this thing off, they got to go through Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, and Georgia, which is a stretch that is ungodly for anyone to go through at any point in this sport. But since Texas got taken and since Ohio State got taken, Jeremy, let me just toss Penn State out there. Penn State got a pretty favorable draw here as well as the 6th seed. Penn State just lost to Oregon. Very interestingly, in the second half of that Big Ten championship game as they lost, I thought their offense came alive like we have not seen it come alive before. They had a couple of 100-yard rushers. This is against Oregon, mind you. Drew Aller threw the ball as well as he's thrown it all year. Tyler Warren was top 10 in the Heisman conversation. They had some receivers step up. They got a really hellacious pass rush. And so if that team gets loose and finds itself the way people are talking about Tennessee finding itself and being dangerous, I think Penn State could be dangerous given the draw they have. And remember, they're in the side of the bracket where a Georgia team may be without its starting quarterback, and they get SMU and Boise as the first two leading up to that hypothetical game. So I'm going to say Penn State, and if they get eliminated first round, just delete the footage.
Well, and I'm fascinated by Notre Dame. I think the nation checked out on Notre Dame after they lost to Northern Illinois. And the reality is Notre Dame's schedule is what it is. They got this de facto kind of, we kind of live in your backyard ACC agreement. But because of that, they're never going to receive a first-round bye, the way that this is set up currently. So they're always going to have to start. But the fact that they start this thing off at home against Indiana, and Jeremy, I'm a nerd about these things. The only time Indiana beat Notre Dame in South Bend, the first time they ever played, November of 1898. So revenge game for Notre Dame, right? No, but they've never played. Like they used to play regularly in the 30s and the 40s, but they've not played. I think they played once since 1958. That was in 1991. So Notre Dame, because I believe Georgia is flawed. What is Georgia's situation with the quarterback? All of these teams are flawed. Quinn Ewers at Texas, he either looks really, really good or it's Wolf. And so Notre Dame is a team no one's talking about, and they haven't talked about them since that Northern Illinois loss, but there they sit, and there might be an opportunity there for them to get on a run that no one's talking about them. I've heard everyone talk about everyone but them, and that includes Indiana, who's going to Notre Dame.
Okay, Ryan, I have been talking about Notre Dame because I am totally with you. I don't think people watched them play over the last 2 months of the season. They were one of the most dominant and consistent teams in the country. Notre Dame has an elite defense, and they have a great run game. Now, we don't know if the pass game is good enough to get them to a national championship game, or what happens if they're down 2 touchdowns and Riley Leonard has to throw it. But to be elite in 2 phases, I think is more than some of the other teams we're talking about when we've got a lot more questions or a lot more inconsistency. So I'm with you, Ryan.
All right, just quickly, Georgia, if Beck can't play, if it's Stockton instead, how does that change things or not change things, Josh?
I have got a very interesting theory on Georgia. I rattled my magic 8 ball, and it came up Georgia. I ended up picking them to win the whole thing, and I am baking in them playing with a backup quarterback, winning the whole thing. There's a strange sort of phenomenon that happens at the college level that doesn't happen so much at the NFL level. If you lose your quarterback at the Sunday level, you're probably done. 9 times out of 10, you're done. At the college level, sometimes that's true. But at Georgia, Carson Beck was already a very turnover-prone player this year. Just the cumulative sum of the parts there was good enough to where Georgia made it through. But sometimes when you have an ultra-talented locker room that has bought into the culture, and they have at Georgia, for better or for worse, whatever you think that means, and you see your number one go down, there is a galvanization that happens amongst guys like that. That's a very prideful group of defensive players, by the way. And there's a galvanization that happens where the actual aggregate of the output raises equal to or maybe even surpasses the level of performance that you would have gotten with your starter in there. And it leaves people looking and wondering, how are they doing this with the backup quarterback? One of my favorite things to do in college for a long time has been see a backup quarterback go down. That's not what I love. What I love is watching the overreaction in the betting market and just blindly betting the team having to play their backup quarterback. So I'm taking that to the extreme right now. I'm actually going to pick Georgia to win the whole thing. Again, same rule applies. If they get eliminated by Notre Dame, just burn the tape.
McGee?
Yeah, well, I saw it firsthand in the SEC championship game down on the sideline, for our ESPN. We did this altcast. And the energy on that sideline, the rest of the stadium, right? These Georgia fans that have had this house of horrors at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, lost 7 conference championship games down there. When their starter goes down, the dread in the stands was completely countered by the reaction on the Georgia sideline. They love Gunnar Stockton. And then for him to lead them straight down the field and score, and in the middle of that drive, put a shoulder down and knock down a safety, it was, you could feel it. And talking to the players after the game, they all said, listen, y'all don't know who he is. That's our guy. He played safety on the scout team on defense for a while. Like, the defensive guys love him. So I'm with Josh. I think there was an energy infusion, and this is not a knock on Beck at all, but there was an absolute increase in energy and certainly no lack of confidence. So it'll be interesting to see. Sometimes when the star goes down, the rest of the team plays better. And I think you certainly saw that, Georgia beating Texas again in that SEC championship game.
Everybody's bullish on Stockton. I do want to ask you guys, I'd be remiss if I didn't. I want to ask you a question about a team that's not in the playoff. Bill Belichick to North Carolina. Paul, is this going to work?
It will, but there is a very short window for it to work. And that's not a joke about Belichick's age. It's just simply what he brings to the table is enormous, the trickle-down effect. But the buzz will only last so long if he can't bring in the right staff, which I think he can, and most important, the right players. So it will be exciting. It comes down to, is it a novelty or is it the real thing? The one thing about North Carolina, it's not hard to improve on what he is taking over for. Mac Brown was at one time a very good coach, but that was a long time ago, and he did a pretty miserable job. So the expectations, while high, will not be unreasonable. I think he has to improve the product quickly and then be an ACC contender in his second or third year, which puts him, guess what, in the 12-team or 14 or 16-team playoff competition.
And you can turn around a culture in college football now in a way that you couldn't, in a time period that you couldn't without the changes that have been implemented in the last years. College football, the way it is structured now, Nicole, makes sense for Bill Belichick in a way it might not have a few years ago, right?
Yeah, I would say that. I would definitely agree with it. And I do think, based on what he said as an introductory press conference, he understands a lot of the intricacies of this. Like, it wasn't like we've had NFL coaches come in the past and like pretend like they know everything, or that they can basically just run it however they want, and it's this JV level of football. I think he understands that this is a totally different sport, and it's just as hard, if not harder, or more complicated. He's going to have to wear a lot of different hats. Like, he's going to be reporting to board of trustees, to university presidents, to donors. He's going to be talking to teenagers. He's going to have to go recruit. He's going to have to do all of these things. But it does seem like he understands that part of it, and then can bring his experience when you talk about free agency and the portal, when you talk about different athlete revenue sharing contracts and figuring out value for different positions and everything that continues to evolve from a business standpoint. That I really do buy. I think that experience will definitely help him in a world that is like kind of changing under our own feet.
Another thing I want to ask you guys about, right? You are in the thick of it every day. And it's not just during college football season, it's all year long. This world where there's so much passion, there's so much scrutiny, there's so many grudges, traditions. How do you handle it?
I think what you have to do, Jeremy, is embrace it, not do what Kirk Herbstreit did a week ago when asked by Greenberg who he likes, and he said, "No, I got all the flack last year. I'm not doing that." That's not how you go about it. You have to wrap your arms around it, because the people that love the sport of college football are hardworking, good, decent people. Most of them. I've dealt with a few felons. But that's beside the point, and they want to be heard, and that's really the most important aspect of it. So I didn't always, Jeremy, but later in my career I embraced it, and I let them have the last word, because I knew I would have an opportunity to get the last word on a program like this.
Josh.
I think you've got to be one of them. It helps if you really are. It helps if you don't have to fake that. It helps, if you grew up in the South like me. I immersed myself in this stuff. I worked in a fabric warehouse all day. I'd listen to Paul from 4 to 7 on internet radio down in Columbus, Georgia, because I wasn't in the Birmingham media market. And so to me, what we do in this microphone, it's no different. I used to go get barbecue with my friends every day at lunch. All we'd do is talk college football. So, why should the format of your show sound any different? Why should the flavor of your content be any different? And also, why should you ever overthink the room here? We get to cover the greatest sport on the face of the earth, and all the warts, the imperfections kind of make it perfect, in a sense that what Ryan said about 20 minutes ago is true. There is a Saturday flavor. It doesn't have to mimic any other thing. When someone starts a sentence with, well, that's the way NFL does it, well, that's good for the NFL. That happens tomorrow, but today's Saturday. So we're going to do it the Saturday way of doing things today. I love that. With all of its imperfections, I love that.
Nicole.
Yeah, I think it's a sport that it does have a connection to fans that is unlike anything else. And so that is going to bring out a lot of very strong feelings. And the passion is unmatched in this sport. And I don't think you want to take away from that. You want the petty, you want the rivalries, you want all of that, because that's what makes this the greatest sport. I think I always try to make sure, even when I'm covering the business stuff like employment and revenue share, things like that, to always find the fun and to stay. And that's why I love the goofy bowls and the food and the items that they're going to throw on coaches to celebrate, like a bunch of Cheez-Its. That stuff is also part of college football. So I think, for as serious as people take it, you also have to have a lot of fun with it. And that's what keeps you going, because to Josh's point, when you're around fans and your friends and you talk about going to games, and when you get to be a fan and go to games like that, it's awesome. It's unmatched. And I think you can never lose sight of that part of it, because then you do feel like it's work and it's a job, instead of being the greatest job because it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah, Jeremy, so we're all on this show right now because of your father, right? You grew up with something. I grew up as the son of an ACC college football official. My dad was a college football official for 40 years. I learned how to cuss properly listening to Eddie Murphy stand-up cassettes and listening to people scream at my father at college football games. You have to embrace the crazy. So we're talking about North Carolina football, right? I was born in North Carolina. I'll be buried in North Carolina. I wrote a column last week about the history of North Carolina football and what Bill Belichick is up against. The fact that they haven't won a conference championship since 1980 when Lawrence Taylor was there. The fact that they've had one 10-win season this century. The fact that the biggest win in the history of the program is the 1981 Gator Bowl, right? And North Carolina fans have stopped me here in Charlotte, where I live, and cussed me because all I did was speak the truth. Well, guess what? When I was a kid and my dad would have a big DPI against North Carolina in the Maryland game on Saturday night, we'd go to church on Sunday morning, and the same people were waiting at church to cuss my dad walking into church. If you don't embrace the crazy, then what are you even doing here? Because to Nicole's point, to Josh's point, to Paul's point, the crazy is the best part. And so that's why this sport is different than any other in the world. And if you can't take somebody throwing a snowball at you at Ohio State, which there's a 99% chance it's going to happen to me on Saturday, then go work at the bank.
All right, let's wrap it up. This has been great, guys. Let's wrap it up with, when you think about the state of college football now, the sustainability of its popularity and its relevance, what first comes to mind, Paul?
Well, there's a concern, Jeremy, because we are on this precipice, and can the fans deal with where we are right now? About a year and a half ago, Laura Rutledge and I were asked to speak to a group in Birmingham, Alabama, called the Red Elephant Club. They are the booster club for the University of Alabama. And I told them a story, and I even pointed at the group and remembered some of their names. I said, 40 years ago, as a young investigative reporter, I was investigating you for paying players. What you did then is legal now. That's where we are currently. And I have some concern that at some point, the fans who love this game, as everyone on this panel has offered, there's nothing like it. We love the crazy. They're going to take a long look at this and go, I don't like what I see. I don't like the fact that my quarterback just left because somebody offered him $5 million. It hasn't happened yet. I'm not saying it's going to happen in 5 or 10 years, but it could happen, and that is my biggest concern for the future.
Josh.
I think I will echo that totally. There is something there. It is not nothing. The Richter scales of concern in college football are not tied to the playoff format, as I said a little while ago, and they're not tied to whether an Auburn fan in Lee County, Alabama, will stop loving that logo, that AU. It's tied to what the adhesive is. Part of its craziness, part of its pageantry, part of its tradition, but part of it is also an understanding in the past of those high school kids chose to play here. They didn't get drafted, they got recruited, they chose, and then they were loyal, for the most part, to the brand. Now, this sounds like 80-year-old guy yelling at cloud stuff, but I'm telling you it matters to fans. I hear it every day. I see it in our analytics every day. There is a turn-off factor when the sport becomes transactional and the portal becomes as proliferated with movement as it is every year. I'm also going to extend that to coaching. The coaching world, do you know a third of college football coaches at the FBS level moved last year? It's just ridiculous. And so if you continue to preach loyalty on both sides of the fence now, but then you're kind of telegraphing to fans that really doesn't exist over here on this side of the curtain like it used to. It doesn't turn them off overnight, like Paul said, and it will never turn all of them off. But it is the height of arrogance and ignorance to think that the same thing could not, in some small way, happen to this sport, the likes of which is happening to the NBA right now, the likes of which NASCAR has gone through, the likes of which pro wrestling went through at the late 90s. You better not lose yourself. You better be keenly aware of what makes your product unique, and most importantly, what attracts your audience to your program. Because if you put it on another stage, there's not a guarantee that they all just blindly follow.
Let's finish up with this, Nicole and Ryan. If there's something coming down the pike that really needs to be addressed by this sport at this point, what is it, Nicole?
Well, obviously, it's the employment question, right? So you're moving into a world where there's going to be revenue sharing and schools can pay their players directly. But does it eventually get to that step where these are employees and an employer relationship? Is it with the conference? Is it with the school? Are there players' unions? So that you're agreeing on and negotiating rules around some of the stuff that is turning people off, because guys can get in the portal every single year and coaches can leave, and it's all operating like free agency, but it's unlimited, it's all the time, and there are no constraints around it. You know, do you get to collective bargaining and have that? That's going to take years to get to that point. But that's going to be an uncomfortable reality for all of college sports to live in. The future of Olympic sports is tied into all of that. There's so much there. But I think that you're going to have to figure out ways to handle all of that, set it up in a way that makes sense, and then still allow us to lean into all the things that we love about college football. One thing I do hope is part of that checklist of things that happens and changes is the way that coaching contracts are structured. I don't think they need to be 10 years fully guaranteed. Maybe now that you can put the players and you can give the money and put the money in the players' pockets, you don't have to pull all that money into coaching salaries and facilities. Pay the players who are the ones who are giving us this great sport and playing every single weekend and Saturdays. Maybe that eventually adjusts some of the things from a business perspective as well. But to Josh's point, don't make everything all about transactions. Don't turn this sport into one where we're just following free agency. We do all of that because we love what happens on Saturdays. You need to figure out a way to continue to prioritize that.
McGee, you get the final word.
Well, and I'll take a little bit of what Nicole said, a little bit of what Paul said, and a little bit of what Josh said, which is Saturday has to feel like Saturday. And, you know, Josh mentioned NASCAR very briefly, and I've written this column in 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 over the last 15 years. I covered NASCAR and watched it rip itself apart. You know, they killed the goose looking for golden eggs. Now they're working overtime to try to reestablish their roots because they assumed, like the emperor's new clothes, everybody's just going to stick around. It'll be fine. No, if we don't say anything, it'll be fine. you can't assume they'll stick around, because one day you'll wake up and they won't be there. And part of that is not just watching the big brands in the Power Four. It's also seeing what attendance is like in the MAC, and what attendance is like in the Sun Belt, and what attendance is like in the Mountain West. And you have to make sure the game is healthy at every single level. And the way you do that is by making sure that the story is about Saturday. We can talk about NIL and transfer portal, and we can talk about all this other stuff we want. It can't be a business meeting. If it becomes a business meeting, people, they go to business meetings all week. They're not going to do that on a Saturday too. So as long as Saturday continues to feel like the way you want it to, no matter what the outcome is, then I think college football will be okay. If they rip those roots out of the ground, then I don't know what's going to happen.
Saturday, not Sunday. Our college football think tank, Nicole Auerbach. Paul Finebaum, you finally made the sports reporters. I'm sorry it was just me, though. Not my dad. Ryan McGee, Josh Pate. Thank you guys so much. You've probably heard by now that an Ohio lawmaker named Josh Williams has proposed a bill that would make planting flags at Ohio Stadium a felony. Okay, fair enough. What happened after the Michigan game was no joke. It was dangerous. And if such a law would mean we don't get pepper spray as part of the post-game celebration, I say bully. Well, maybe it shouldn't be a felony. That's pretty strong. I'd probably just fine the flag planters and ban them from the state of Ohio until the next Michigan game. To be clear, the law would apply equally to Ohio State players, not that they would plant flags on their home field. What's amazing is that there's been no similar movement to make a much more dangerous phenomenon a felony or even a misdemeanor. Flag planting might be provocative, but athletes and fans get hurt much more frequently when fans storm the field or a court. See Kyle Filipowski, the Duke All-American. Remember what happened to him at Wake Forest? And see one of the biggest stars in sports right now, Caitlin Clark. Remember when she was knocked down earlier this year? She could easily have been seriously injured after the Hawkeyes were upset on the road. Who done it? Where did this reckless act take place? In Columbus, Ohio. Representative Williams, the bill is in your court. Thanks for joining us for the Sports Reporters.